He paid for the umbrella stand outside my office door to be replaced, once, without telling me, after mine cracked in a hailstorm and I mentioned it only once, in passing, to someone else entirely. That's the kind of thing he did. Small, untraceable. The sort of kindness you'd only notice if you were counting, and for years I didn't count. I found out 4 years in that he'd been quietly paying my daughter's school fees the entire time. We never once touched. Not a hand, not a moment, nothing anyone could have pointed to and called wrong. That's the boundary. It held the whole time. I want you to understand that before anything else, because everything I'm about to tell you will sound, at certain points, like it's building towards something it never actually became. I should start with how it began, because the order matters, and because I think I owe it to both of us to tell this in the sequence it actually happened, rather than working backward from the ending the way I've caught myself doing in my own head for longer than I'd like to admit. My name is Celia Marsh. I was 31 when I met him, working as a paralegal at a mid-sized firm in Baltimore called Whitfield & Cole, on the 9th floor of a building that overlooked the harbor if you stood at exactly the right angle in the break room. I'd come to the job 2 years after my divorce, with a 6-year-old daughter named Ruthie, and considerably less financial cushion than I let anyone at that office know about. I was good at the job. I want to say that early, because it matters later, I built a real professional life there, on my own merits, and everything that follows sits on top of that, not in place of it. He was 51 when I started. Gerald Voss, senior partner. The kind of name that was on letterhead and building directories and the sort of donor plaques that hang in university lobbies. He'd interviewed me himself, near the end of a long day of candidates, and asked me exactly one question none of the others had. What does a normal Tuesday actually look like for you once you get Ruthie to school and get here? Nobody else in that interview process had said her name, because nobody else had bothered to look at the line in my resume where I'd explained the 2-year gap. I got the job that afternoon. I went home and made grilled cheese for dinner and didn't tell Ruthie why I was crying a little while I did it. He was married 32 years to a woman named Constance, whom I met exactly 4 times over the following years. Always briefly, always at firm functions, always kind in a way that felt genuine rather than performed. I want to name that plainly, at the start, because it's the fact underneath everything else in this story, and I never once let myself forget it, even in the years when forgetting it might have been easier. The routine that mattered most started in my first month, almost by accident. He kept unusual hours in by 7, most days before almost anyone else, and I'd started coming in early myself, not out of ambition exactly, but because the building was quiet then, and quiet was rare in my life those years. With a 6-year-old and a commute and a job I was still learning. We fell into a rhythm without ever discussing it, coffee in the small kitchenette on 9, most mornings, 15 minutes before the floor filled up, talking about nothing that mattered and everything that did. I never once scheduled it. Neither did he. It simply happened, 4 or 5 mornings a week, for years. He had a habit, during those mornings, of reading the first page of the newspaper standing up, refusing to sit until he'd finished it, a small superstition he never explained, and I never asked him to. I found myself doing the same thing, years later, in my own kitchen, standing at the counter reading headlines before I let myself sit down with my coffee, without remembering exactly when I'd started. The second motif was smaller. He always asked about Ruthie by name, never generically, never how's your daughter, always how's Ruthie doing with the multiplication tables, or whatever the specific current thing happened to be, because I'd mentioned it once, weeks earlier, and he'd apparently filed it away the way he filed away everything. It took me a long time to understand that this precision wasn't just good memory. It was its own kind of attention, deliberately paid, deliberately maintained. The third thing I noticed slower. In 4 years, he never once asked me anything about my personal life beyond Ruthie. Not about dating, not about my ex-husband, not about the loneliness I know must have shown on my face some mornings whether I wanted it to or not. He waited, always, for me to open a door before he'd step through it. I understand now that this wasn't distance. It was the opposite, dressed carefully, as manners. I need to say plainly what the gap between us actually was, because I've heard enough people since then flatten stories like mine into something simpler than they were. He was a senior partner who could, with a word, have shaped whether I kept my job in a firm that laid off support staff more than once during those years. I was a single mother in my early 30s with a young daughter and no real safety net. He was a married man 20 years my senior with 3 grown children and a life built entirely apart from the 9th floor kitchenette. Neither of us ever pretended that gap wasn't there. We built whatever this was in the narrow space beside it, and neither of us, in 4 years, ever leaned on it. In my second year, I started noticing things I hadn't let myself notice before. The way he'd find a reason to walk past the paralegal bullpen twice some mornings instead of once, on his way to somewhere he didn't actually need to go. The way he remembered, without being told twice, that Ruthie was allergic to walnuts, and mentioned it, unprompted. The one time the firm ordered catered lunch from a place that used them in everything. The way that once, at a late-night document review before a trial, the two of us the last ones on the floor, he stood close enough at the copier that neither of us moved for several seconds longer than the machine required, and neither of us spoke of it after. Denise, one of the other paralegals, asked me about it directly once, in the elevator, of all places, just the two of us riding down at the end of a Friday. "You and Voss," she said. "I'm not saying anything. I'm just saying I've never seen him remember another assistant's kid's allergy." I gave her the answer I'd apparently rehearsed without knowing it. He's just thorough. Good with details. She looked at me a beat too long. The doors opened, and she let it go. I've thought about that elevator ride more than most things from those years, how I handed her something true and something false in the same breath, and didn't notice myself doing it until much later that night. Here's what I privately believed during that stretch, though I want to be honest that I was never certain. I believed he'd built, somewhere private in himself, a version of caring about me and about Ruthie that he'd decided, deliberately, would never become anything else. Not repression, I don't think it was that. I think he'd looked at it clearly, the way he looked at every case, and made a decision, and then quietly remade it every single morning for years, without ever needing my help to make it. I believed the mornings were, for him, a controlled, rationed amount of something he'd otherwise have had to give up entirely. And I believed, this is the part I was least sure of, that some portion of what he felt wasn't really about me specifically, but about a version of fatherhood or usefulness he'd already mostly finished living, that he got to visit for 15 minutes a day without having to explain the visit to anyone, including himself. I could be wrong about all of it. I never asked him outright, and he never told me outright, and everything I've described is a story I built to live inside a silence neither of us ever broke. The obstacle was never a mystery. It was Constance, and 32 years, and 3 grown children who still came home for holidays, and the plain fact that whatever else he was to me, he was a decent man who'd made vows and intended to keep every one of them. He mentioned Constance more than the conversation required, if anything, a habit I came to understand as its own kind of fence, built and maintained on purpose, morning after morning. There was one morning, in my 3rd year, when the fence was tested without either of us choosing it. I'd come in unusually early after a bad night with Ruthie, a fever that had kept us both up until nearly 4, and found him already there, and something in my face must have given the whole night away, because he didn't ask what was wrong. He just poured me coffee, and sat with me in silence for a long moment, and then reached over and, very briefly, set his hand over mine on the counter, not holding it, just resting there, for maybe 3 seconds, before he withdrew it and said, "Go home. Take the day. I'll square it with scheduling." I did. Neither of us ever mentioned those 3 seconds again, but I understood, standing in my kitchen that afternoon with Ruthie asleep on the couch, that something had been offered and understood and gently closed, all at once, without either of us needing to say a single word about it. There's a scene from that same year I haven't told you yet, because it's the one that still makes my chest tighten a little. Even now, Ruthie got sick again that winter, not the fever this time, something longer. A respiratory thing that turned into 2 weeks out of school, and a specialist referral I couldn't get an appointment for until I called in a favor from someone at the hospital where a friend worked. I came into the office those 2 weeks looking like a woman running on fumes, because I was one, and Gerald never once asked me directly what was wrong. He simply started leaving things on my desk, a printout of an article about pediatric pulmonology from a doctor he apparently knew socially, a business card for a specialist with a note that just said, "Ask for Dr. Anand, mention my name, he'll see her faster," and then, never once, brought it up again, unless I did. I used the referral. Ruthie was seen within 4 days instead of the 6 weeks the regular scheduling line had quoted me. I thanked him for it once, briefly, in the kitchenette, and he waved it off with something like, "I know people. It's not a favor, it's just knowing which door to knock on." I let him have that framing, because I think he needed it more than I did, needed the thing to be small, procedural, not a debt either of us would have to carry forward. The eyebrow-raised scene came that spring, and it was Marcus, one of the other senior partners, a man who'd been at the firm even longer than Gerald. We were in a staffing meeting, deciding which paralegal would support which case team for an upcoming trial, and Gerald steered the assignment so that I'd be on his team again. The 3rd time running, framing it as, "Celia knows the Hargrove file better than anyone, it makes sense." After the meeting, Marcus lingered by the door and said, not unkindly, "You keep her close, Gerald." Gerald didn't answer right away. "Then, she does good work. I don't waste good work on someone else's case." Marcus looked between us for a second, the kind of look that does arithmetic it would rather not finish out loud, and then just nodded and let it go. There was a firm holiday party that same year, held at a hotel downtown, the kind of event where everyone dresses a little more carefully than usual, and nobody quite says what they mean over the past hors d'oeuvres. I'd come alone. Paul was still 8 months from entering the picture, and at some point in the evening found myself near the small band they'd hired, watching Gerald across the room in conversation with 2 other partners. Constance at his side in a dark green dress, her hand resting easily on his arm, the way 20 years of marriage lets a hand rest. He caught my eye across the room, briefly, the way he sometimes did, and there was nothing in it that anyone watching could have named. But I remember the specific quality of it, not longing exactly, nothing so simple. More like a man checking, instinctively, that someone he'd quietly assigned himself to look after was doing all right in a room full of people. I lifted my glass slightly, the smallest acknowledgement, and he returned it, and then his attention went back to Constance and the conversation at hand, seamlessly, the way it always did. Denise found me by the band a few minutes later. "He does that a lot," she said, not unkindly, nodding faintly in Gerald's direction. "Checks on you in a room." I've watched him do it at 3 of these now. I said something about him just being a considerate boss, the same rehearsed line I always reached for. And she smiled in a way that told me she'd stopped believing it a while ago, but had decided, out of some old loyalty, not to push. I've thought about that smile more than I let on. It was the closest anyone ever came to naming the thing directly, and even then, she let me keep it unnamed. I had my own theories in that period about what any of it meant, including the ones I eventually decided were wrong. For a long stretch, I believed he simply had a soft spot for single mothers, generally, that I was interchangeable with anyone who'd walked into that interview with a similar story. I believed that until the week I started seeing someone, briefly, 6 months, a man named Paul, who worked in commercial real estate and was perfectly pleasant and entirely wrong for reasons I couldn't articulate at the time. I mentioned Paul to Gerald one morning, casually, the way I mentioned most things, and watched him take it in without a single visible shift in his face, and then say, "That's good. Ruthie deserves a stable house," in a voice so level it told me everything by how much effort the levelness clearly cost him. I broke it off with Paul 4 months later. I told myself it was about compatibility. I've never told anyone, until now, that some part of it was that I couldn't stop comparing the quiet, unasked-for attention I got every morning in that kitchenette to whatever it was Paul and I were failing to build on purpose. That's the part of this I'm least proud of. I let a decision that size get shaped by a man who never once asked me to shape anything around him. He didn't know about Paul beyond the mention. I made sure he never knew more than that. That was its own kind of dishonesty, not to Gerald, but to Paul, who deserved a reason that was actually about him. I want to tell you about the one time Gerald said Constance's name to me in a way that wasn't offhand, the only time in 4 years he spoke of her with anything other than that careful, ordinary fondness he used deliberately, the way you use a fence you've built on purpose. It was a Tuesday morning, unremarkable in every way until it wasn't. I'd come in early as usual, and found him already at the small kitchenette table, not reading the newspaper, just sitting with his coffee untouched in front of him, which was so unlike him that I asked, without thinking, if something was wrong. "Constance had a scare yesterday," he said. "A fall, nothing broken, but the doctor wants some tests. She's fine. I want to be clear, she's fine." He said she's fine twice, the way people do when they're still convincing themselves of it. I sat up most of the night thinking about the shape of the last 30 years. Not regretting them. I want you to understand that clearly, whatever else I say next. I don't regret a single year of my marriage. But there's a particular kind of thinking that happens at 4 in the morning next to someone you love who just reminded you she won't always be there. And some of that thinking, last night, was about this. About these mornings, about what they are and aren't, and what I owe both of you, her and you, in terms of honesty about it. I didn't say anything. I'd learned by then not to fill his silences. "I've decided," he said, "that what we have here isn't a betrayal of her, because it's never asked anything of her that she didn't already understand and consent to, in her way." I told her about these mornings years ago, not dramatically, just plainly, the way I tell her most things. She said something to me once that I've never forgotten. She said, "I'm not worried about a woman you have coffee with. I'd be worried about a woman you felt you had to lie to me about." I've built my life around that distinction since then. I want you to know it's the only reason I've allowed myself to keep coming down here every morning instead of stopping years ago. "Do you think you should stop?" I asked, because it seemed like the only honest question available. He considered it for a long moment. "No," he said finally. I think stopping would be its own kind of dishonesty. Pretending something that's real and contained and harmless is actually dangerous enough to require ending. I think the more honest thing is what we've already been doing. Showing up. Staying inside the lines we've both, without ever discussing it, agreed to keep. He looked at me then, directly, in a way he rarely allowed himself. I would ask the same thing of you, if you ever found yourself wondering the same thing I wondered at 4 this morning. Ask whether it's costing anyone something real. If the answer's no, I don't think either of us owes anyone an ending, just because a thing might, in a different life, have been something else. I told him I understood, and I did, and I also understood, sitting there, that he had just given me, as plainly as he ever gave anything, the entire shape of what this had always been and would always be. Not a secret, not a betrayal, but a small, contained, deliberately bounded thing that both people in his marriage had already made peace with, long before I'd ever had to. The morning obstacle-tested scene, the 3 seconds of his hand over mine, wasn't the only one. There was a second, quieter one, a year later, that I think matters more precisely because nothing about it looked like anything from the outside. The firm sent a small group of us to a conference in Philadelphia, and Gerald and I ended up on the same late train back after everyone else had taken earlier flights. The train was delayed outside the city for almost 2 hours, some signal failure, and we sat across from each other in a nearly empty car, watching the same stretch of dark rail yard through the window for far longer than the view justified. At some point, without any preamble, he said, "I think about what year this would have needed to be. For this to be simpler." I asked what he meant, though I already knew. "Before Constance," he said. "Or 20 years from now, maybe, if we're both still." He stopped himself there. Didn't finish it. Looked instead at the rail yard. I didn't finish it for him. We sat like that until the train finally lurched forward, and neither of us ever mentioned that unfinished sentence again. I don't think either version of that sentence was ever going to happen, and I don't think he believed it would either. I think he needed to say it once, out loud, to someone other than himself. And I happened to be the only person there to hear it. Gerald retired the autumn Ruthie turned 10, 4 years after I'd started at the firm. It wasn't sudden. Nothing about him ever was, but it still landed differently than I expected. He announced it at a partners' meeting I wasn't even in the room for. I heard about it secondhand, from Denise, who caught me in the hallway with an expression that told me she thought I'd want to sit down for it. He'd told people it was about Constance's health, something manageable, but demanding of more attention than a full caseload allowed, and about 34 years being enough for one man to give one firm. Our mornings didn't stop right away. We had maybe 3 weeks of them left. In that strange final stretch, each one a little quieter than the last. Both of us aware of a clock neither of us mentioned. On his actual last day, he didn't read the newspaper standing up. He sat down with it immediately, coffee first, headlines second, and I noticed and said nothing. I think now he simply forgot, for once in 4 years, and I think the forgetting told me more than getting it exactly right ever could have, that the ritual had never really been about the newspaper. He gave me a card before he left, his home address and a phone number written on the back in his careful lawyer's hand, and said, "If Ruthie ever needs anything, and you can't get someone on the phone fast enough, call that number first." I kept the card in my wallet for the next several years, behind my license, in the place reserved for things I might need suddenly and couldn't afford to misplace. I told myself, in the years after he left, a version of the relationship that I understand now was mostly a story I needed in order to keep functioning without those mornings. I told myself it had been simple workplace kindness, the kind good bosses show good employees, nothing more. I told myself the hand over mine that one winter morning had been comfort. Plainly, the way you'd comfort any exhausted colleague. I told myself Denise's question in the elevator had been answered honestly. I got promoted once in the years after he left to a senior paralegal role with real responsibility. And I told myself I'd earned it entirely on my own, which was true, and also not the whole truth, though I didn't know that yet. There's one thing from that in-between stretch, the years after he retired but before the discovery, that I've been putting off telling you, because it still sits strangely in my memory, half ordinary and half enormous, depending on which day I examine it. It was Ruthie's 8th grade graduation. A small ceremony in the school gymnasium, folding chairs, and a slightly too loud sound system, the kind of event that matters enormously to the people in it and to almost no one else. I'd invited my sister, who couldn't make it in from out of state, and my mother, whose health didn't allow the drive anymore, and so I sat largely alone in that gymnasium, clapping for a girl I was prouder of than I had words for, feeling the specific, private loneliness of celebrating something big with no one beside me to turn to. Near the end, scanning the crowd out of some reflex I didn't examine at the time, I thought I saw him. A man near the back, standing rather than sitting. The way you stand when you've come only to watch and intend to leave before anyone can make it more than that. By the time the ceremony ended and I made my way back through the crowd, whoever it had been was gone. I never confirmed it was him. I never asked, in all the years after, whether he'd actually come. Some part of me has always preferred not knowing for certain, preferred to hold the possibility open. The way you hold open a door you're not sure anyone's going to walk through, because the holding open is its own kind of comfort. I mentioned it to Ruthie herself only once, years later, after the discovery. After I'd finally told her, carefully, in pieces, over the course of a long evening, who Gerald Voss actually was and what he'd done for us. She was 18 by then, already sharper than I'd been at that age about the shapes adult lives take. She listened to the whole thing without interrupting, and when I finished, she was quiet for a while, and then she said something I still think about. "Do you regret that nothing happened? Between you two, I mean. Actually happened." I told her the truth, which surprised me a little in the saying of it. "No," I said. I think if something had happened, it would have become a different story. One about the two of us. Mostly this way, it stayed a story about him choosing, over and over, for 4 years, to help two people who never asked him to and never could have paid him back. I think that's rarer than the other kind of story. I think I'd rather have had this one. She didn't say anything else about it that night, but a few weeks later, unprompted, she asked if she could write him a letter. Not to reopen anything, not to ask for anything, just to say thank you directly, in her own words, for the plays she now understood he might have quietly attended, for the tuition she now understood hadn't been a scholarship at all, for a kindness she'd spent her whole childhood inside of without ever knowing its true shape. I gave her his address. I never read what she wrote. Some things, I've come to believe, don't need to pass through me at all. They belong directly between the person who gave and the person who received, without a translator standing in the middle, however much that translator loves them both. The discovery happened almost 5 years after he retired, the week Ruthie turned 15 and came home from her private school, the one she'd attended since 6th grade, on what I'd always believed was a partial scholarship the school had quietly extended after I'd inquired about financial aid, with a form that needed a parent signature for the following year's enrollment. I sat down to fill in the tuition assistance section, the way I did every year, and called the school's business office to confirm the aid amount before I wrote anything down, a habit born of years of budgeting to the dollar. The woman on the phone, new to the position, pulled up the account and read me something that didn't match what I'd expected. "It looks like the balance has been covered in full each year through a designated third-party payment," she said. "Should I send the usual invoice to the same account?" I told her I didn't understand what she meant. She read me a name off the account. Gerald Voss. I didn't say anything for a long moment. She must have sensed something in my silence, because she asked if everything was all right, and I told her, faintly, that it was, and that I'd call back. I sat in my kitchen for a long time after that call, the enrollment form still blank in front of me, understanding for the first time that the partial scholarship I'd believed in for 4 years had never existed at the school's initiative at all. There had been no scholarship committee, no financial aid review. There had only been one man, quietly and consistently, for 4 years, paying the full difference between what I could afford and what the school charged, routed through the business office in a way designed, deliberately, so that I would never have reason to look closely enough to find it. I drove to his house 2 days later. I hadn't seen him in nearly 5 years. He answered the door himself. Constance, he told me once we were seated, had passed the previous spring, something I hadn't known, hadn't been told, because I was no longer someone anyone thought to call with that kind of news. He looked older in the specific way grief and time both age of face, features settling into more weight than I remembered. He didn't seem surprised to see me. I understood, watching his face as he let me in, that some part of him had been expecting this exact visit for 4 years, the way you expect a bill you know is eventually coming due. We sat in his kitchen, not so different from the one I'd pictured all those years he'd asked about mine. "The school called an account under your name," I said, "for Ruthie's tuition." 4 years of it. He didn't deny it, and he didn't rush to explain it either. He let the silence sit the way he always had, the way I'd learned, over 4 years of mornings, meant something real was being assembled before it was spoken. "I set it up the year you started at the firm," he said finally. "Not immediately. About 8 months in. I'd learned by then what the actual math looked like for you, what a single income covering that school actually cost. Once I understood, you weren't telling anyone how tight it really was." "You could have told me," I said. "Given it to me directly. I could have thanked you. I could have. I don't know." Understood what I was accepting. "You wouldn't have accepted it," he said, and he wasn't wrong, and we both knew it. "You'd have refused it outright, out of pride, or worse, out of fear of what it would mean about the two of us if you took something that size from a married man. I didn't want you carrying that calculation every single day for 4 years. I wanted Ruthie in that school, and I wanted you not to have to choose between that and your own sense of what was appropriate between us. So I made it invisible. That was the only way it could exist without costing either of us something neither of us could afford." "What did it cost you?" I asked. "Doing it that way. Quietly, for 4 years, never telling anyone." He was quiet again, longer this time, less than you'd think, in dollars. Considerably more, in other ways. Constance knew. "I want you to know that I never hid it from her in the sense of secrecy. I told her the year I started it. She asked me once why I never told you directly, and I said something to her I've thought about more than almost anything else I've said in my life. I said, because if I tell her, it becomes a debt. If I don't, it just becomes what happened." She let that stand. I think she understood it better than I did, honestly, at the time. "Did she mind?" I asked, because I had to. She minded the idea of it being a secret from me to her. Once she understood it wasn't that she always knew, that nothing was hidden from her specifically, she made her peace with what it was. She told me once that she wasn't frightened of a woman I quietly helped. She said she'd have been frightened of a man who needed to hide something like that from his own wife. The fact that I didn't have to hide it from her was, for her, most of the answer. I sat with that for a long while, recalibrating, the way I imagine anyone does when a decade of assumed history gets quietly rewritten by one phone call and one kitchen conversation. I thought of the morning with the fever, his hand over mine for 3 seconds before he withdrew it and sent me home. I thought of the referral card for the specialist, framed as nothing, as just knowing which door to knock on. I thought of the train delayed outside Philadelphia, the unfinished sentence about years that would have made it simpler. All of it sat differently now, not changed in its facts, but changed in its weight. Why tell me now? I mean, why did the school system even reveal it? You could have kept routing it invisibly forever. I set it to lapse the year Ruthie graduates, he said. I hadn't planned for you to find out before then, if I'm honest. But someone new in that office clearly didn't know the protocol for a designated payer account, and pulled up the name where it shouldn't have surfaced yet. That part wasn't my doing. But I won't pretend I'm sorry it happened while I'm still around to explain it myself, rather than leaving you to find some paperwork after I'm not. We didn't become anything, that afternoon or after. I want to be honest about that, because it's the truest part of this account. There was no confession that reorganized either of our lives, no beginning of anything new. He was a widower in his late 50s who had quietly protected a young mother and her daughter for 4 years without asking anything in return, and I was a woman who had just learned the exact shape and cost of that protection, all at once, sitting in a kitchen that smelled faintly of the same coffee he used to make each morning on the 9th floor. What we did instead was simpler. We sat another hour, and he asked, in his old careful way, how Ruthie was doing, not generically, by name, the way he always had. And I told him. And for that hour, it was almost like the mornings again, except without anything left unspoken between us. Before I left his house that afternoon, he asked me to wait a moment and disappeared into another room. Returning with a small wooden box I recognized instantly, it had sat on the corner of his desk for the entire 4 years I'd worked there, and I'd never once seen him open it. I want you to have this, he said, setting it on the table between us. Inside were small things that meant nothing to anyone but him and, apparently, me. A folded page from a newspaper, the exact edition from a morning years back when Ruthie's school photo had run in a local parenting supplement he must have somehow tracked down and clipped. A pressed ticket stub from a school play of Ruthie's he'd apparently attended once. Quietly, from the back row, without ever telling me he'd been there. And, at the bottom, a single index card in his handwriting, dated the year he'd started the tuition payments that read only, RM, 4th grade, multiplication tables. Keep asking. I didn't trust my voice for a moment, looking at that card. You went to one of her plays? The spring recital, her 4th grade year. You mentioned it once, in passing, that you were nervous about getting off work in time. He said it plainly, without any weight attached, though the weight was obviously enormous. I went early, sat in the back, left before it ended so you'd never see me there. I wanted to see the thing you were proud of. I didn't need her to know I'd come, or you either, at the time. I just needed to have seen it once. I thought, sitting there, of every small motif from those 4 years. The newspaper read standing up, the precise memory of Ruthie's schoolwork, the hand over mine for 3 seconds on a bad morning, and understood that none of it had ever been separate acts. It had all been one continuous, careful attention, distributed across small enough moments that no single one of them could ever have been called anything but kindness. Until you added them all together and saw the shape of what they actually were. Why give me this now, I asked, instead of just letting it stay yours? Because I'm not young anymore, and neither are you, and I'd rather you have the proof of it while I can still explain what it meant, instead of leaving you to find a box after I can't." He looked at me steadily. "I don't need anything back for it. I never did. I just didn't want it to disappear the way things disappear when nobody's left to say what they were." Before I left that day, I made myself say the thing I'd come to say, the thing underneath the tuition and the box and everything else. "That Tuesday morning," I said. "The one where you told me about Constance's fall and what she'd said about not worrying about a woman you had coffee with. Did she know then about the tuition, or did that come later?" "She knew about the tuition from the start," he said. "I told her the same year I began it. I never wanted a single part of this hidden from her, even the parts I kept hidden from you. She never once asked me to stop. She only ever asked me to be honest with her about the size of it, which I always was." I thought of the holiday party then, Constance's hand resting on his arm in her dark green dress, the look she'd never once given me that could have been read as anything but warmth. I understood, finally, completely, that she had spent years being generous in a way I'd never had the full picture to appreciate, that a woman I'd only ever seen 4 times had quietly made room, in her own marriage, for her husband to look after a struggling young mother and a little girl, and had never once made either of us feel the weight of that room being made. "I owe her something," I said. "I don't know what, but something." "She'd have told you that you don't," Gerald said. "She was never a woman who collected debts. She'd have told you the only thing you owed anyone was to raise your daughter well, and you did that, entirely on your own strength, every single day. The rest of it, the tuition, the referral, the box, none of that was ever alone. It was just what happened, because 2 people decided, independently and together, that it was the right thing to quietly do." I sat with that a long time before I finally stood to leave, and understood that the reckoning I'd driven there expecting, some accounting of years, some final naming of an unspoken thing, had already happened, in its own way, long before I arrived. In a marriage I'd only ever seen the edges of. What was left for me wasn't a confession. It was just gratitude, plain and enormous, and finally allowed to be spoken aloud. I took the box home. It sits now on a shelf in my own kitchen, not hidden, not displayed either, just there, the way the plain fact of him has always just been there, underneath everything else in my life since the year I walked into that interview, and he was the only person who said my daughter's name out loud. I still have the card he gave me the day he retired, his home number on the back, though I've never had to use it. I think restraint gets a bad reputation, in a world that keeps telling us love only counts if it's spoken, chased, resolved into something with a name. But some of the truest care I've ever received came from a man who decided, quietly, for 4 years, to give everything and ask for nothing, not even acknowledgement, and who let the truth surface only when he judged I could finally carry it without it costing either of us anything at all. If this story stayed with you, join our community by hitting that like button and subscribing for more quiet, honest stories.